terrorist threats and tactics like the use of small drones. I want to thank Secretary Pompeo for hosting this meeting of foreign ministers on NATO's 70th anniversary. Over 7 decades, NATO has stepped up time and again to keep our people safe. And we will continue to stand together to prevent conflict and preserve peace. And with that, I'm ready to take your questions.
Okay. We'll go to the gentleman in the front row.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much, Rahim Rashidi or Mr. Kurd from Kurdistan TV. How do you see the threat of ISIS in future? And any comments about Peshmerga role in fight terrorism and ISIS? Thank you very much.
So we have made enormous progress in the fight against ISIS. Just some months ago, ISIS controlled vast territories in Iraq and Syria. At some point, they controlled the territory equal the size of the United Kingdom and millions of people. Now they have lost control over all the territory they controlled. But ISIS is still a threat. ISIL has gone underground, and we need to continue our efforts to make sure that ISIS never returns in the way we saw ISIS a few months ago. And that's exactly the reason why we need to continue our efforts in the global coalition to defeat ISIS. And that's also the reason why NATO is not reducing, but actually stepping up our efforts to provide training, capacity building, help to the Iraqi security forces so they can stabilize their own country. As I said, one of the best weapons we have in the fight against terrorism is to build local capacity. NATO is also doing many other things. We are also working together to address the threat related to foreign fighters, including sharing of biometric data, which is important for many or all NATO allies.
Okay, with Rustavi too. Can you put up your hand, please?
Thank you very much. Going to end non-NATO. Thank you.
So we are stepping up our efforts in the Black Sea. We just agreed, or the Black Sea region, we just agreed a package with more surveillance exercises and other issues which we strongly believe are relevant for the Black Sea region, and of course also then working with our partners Georgia and Ukraine. 3 NATO allies are literal states to the Black Sea: Turkey, Bulgaria and Romania, but also 2 close partners, Georgia and Ukraine, are Black Sea countries. We work with them now as we speak. One of NATO's naval standing groups are or is deployed in the Black Sea, and are actually exercising both together with Georgian naval forces and with Ukrainian naval forces. So this just shows that NATO has increased its presence in the Black Sea region with more naval presence. We have the multinational brigade in Romania, and we have also air policing in the region. So NATO is present, and NATO is strengthening the cooperation with our close partners, Georgia and Ukraine.
Okay, we had New York Times at the back. Yeah.
With Afghanistan, it would be down there. Okay, sorry. Technical difficulties. You mentioned with Afghanistan would be in together, out together. We are looking at a possible peace agreement that would end the international presence in some point of time, whether that is 1 year, 2 years, or 3 years. How should NATO ensure that the gains, the training it's done over the last 18 years stay in place, and that the partner forces that have been built up do not dissolve, as has happened in other countries?
Ambassador Khalizad has stated many times that what he is negotiating is not a leave agreement but a peace agreement. And of course the overall aim of the negotiations which are going now is to reach a political agreement which make it possible to have peace in Afghanistan for the first time in many, many years. But as we have all stated many, many times, also, of course, in the consultations with Ambassador Khalizad, is that we need to make sure that any peace deal ensures that Afghanistan never again becomes a safe haven for international terrorists, and has also to build on the achievements we have made, not least in promoting the rights of women and girls related to education, basic human rights. A part of any sustainable peace in Afghanistan has also to include Afghan reconciliation. So the talks which are going on now is in a way the first step towards a broader peace process, which also include, of course, the Afghan government, because that's the only way to have a sustainable peace. Then the presence of international forces is part of these negotiations. So what kind of presence under what kind of framework? Well, that remains to be decided. That will be part of the agreement. In NATO, we are now looking into different options for how NATO can support a potential peace agreement, but it's far too early to conclude. The main issues now is to provide as much support as possible to the ongoing talks, and then based on that we will make decisions on our future presence and in what form NATO allies will or will not be part of any future international presence.
Okay, BBC over there. Yeah, lady over there. Yeah.
Thank you. There's an argument to be made, Secretary General, that the tensions in the past Russia have partly been because NATO has expanded right up to Russian borders. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can, but it's a bit, yeah.
So I'll repeat. There's an argument that NATO is partly responsible for the tensions with Russia because it has expanded right up to the borders of Russia, despite promises made to the contrary by officials when this was under discussion. Do you think it's the right approach to constantly and publicly advertise open invitations to Georgia and Ukraine under those circumstances? Doesn't that just make the tension worse?
I think we all have to understand that Georgia and Ukraine are independent sovereign nations, which has the sovereign right to choose their own path. So just the idea that it is a provocation against Russia that Georgia aspires for membership or that Ukraine does the same is really, really dangerous. Because as soon as you accept that that's a provocation against Russia, then you accept that Russia has the right to decide what neighbors can do. And that is the same as to accept a world order where big powers can decide what neighbors can do or cannot do. And that is to re-establish the whole idea of spheres of influence. And coming from Norway, actually a small country bordering Russia, I'm very glad that back in 1949, when we joined NATO, that the United States and the United Kingdom and the other founding members of NATO did never accept that the Soviet Union could decide what Norway could do. So in exactly the same way, of course, Georgia and Ukraine has the right to choose their own path. It's not provocation. It's not directed against anyone. It's a sovereign right of every sovereign nation to decide the direction of their own country. And it's only for then the aspirant countries and for NATO to decide at the end whether they or when they can become members. So, so I say this because, so first of all, NATO has always been bordering the Soviet Union or Russia. Norway has done that since we were a founding member. Second, the enlargement is not, in a way, NATO moving east. It's actually those countries, Central and Eastern European countries, who strongly wanted to join NATO and have decided so through democratic processes. And we have to respect that and not regard that as a provocation, because then we say that sovereign democratic decisions by sovereign democratic nations is not acceptable because a big neighbor doesn't like it.
Okay, I know we have lots more questions. Unfortunately, we need to wrap now, and Secretary Pompeo will be coming right after. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
You can't.
That's our earpiece that's on this issue. Can you just put it on? That's our earpiece, the white. It's my earpiece.
So good afternoon, everyone. 70 years ago today, 12 courageous nations came together to form an alliance that to this day remains the bedrock guarantor of Western security and democratic liberties. Today, our 29 nations believe in our founding mission. We believe in deterrence to keep the peace. We believe in our common defense as captured in Article 5 of the treaty. We believe that Western democratic ideals are worth defending, and defend them we will. Our nations have inherited a strong alliance because our predecessors had the wisdom to continue to adapt to the challenges at hand. And now it's our duty to adapt to the challenges like radical Islamic terrorism, cyber attacks, uncontrolled migration, Chinese strategic competition, and indeed, still, Russian aggression. Today we had wide-ranging, robust discussions. We took important decisions on urgent problem sets. Vladimir Putin harbors dark dreams of imperialism. This is evident from his invasions of Georgia and Ukraine and his meddling in Syria, and now in Venezuela. He wants to split our alliance and weaken our democratic resolve. In light of Russia's attacks on Western democracies, we agreed to improve our defenses against hybrid warfare, develop new strategies to deter it, and identify prompt and effective responses. We also discussed terrorism. NATO plays a key role in the fight against Islamist terrorism, both inside and outside of our alliance. The U.S. especially appreciates NATO's commitment to the NATO mission in Iraq. For nearly 18 years, NATO allies and partners have fought terrorism in Afghanistan. We've trained and advised and assisted the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces. I updated our NATO counterparts on the work of Ambassador Khalilzad. His diplomatic undertaking is executing at my direction. The United States will ensure that our collective sacrifices are not wasted and that terrorists can never again threaten us from Afghanistan's soil. Lastly, we discussed burden sharing. No alliance can survive without proper investment from all of its partners. Our allies have joined the United States in recognizing the need for greater burden sharing, each and every one of them. I'm pleased to say that since 2016, our allies have pledged $41 billion, and that number will increase to $100 billion by the end of next year, 2020. That's no small feat. It's money well spent. Nations have contributed should be proud. You have the deep gratitude of President Trump for that, but I told them, too, there's more work to do. It's important for them to make the case to their citizenry for why this collective deterrence remains important, that spending commitments matter. They lead to political solidarity. As a military alliance, our posture should be second to none. It's self-evident that our armies, navies, and air forces must be fully trained and equipped and ready to go when called upon in conflict or crisis. At the Leaders Summit last July, we took a major step forward in agreeing to the 430s initiative. Now it is time for us to fulfill those goals. 70 years ago, the great Dean Acheson said that the NATO alliance was, quote, a statement of the facts and lessons of history, end of quote. He knew that if free nations do not stand together, they will fall one by one. The same is true today. As for the United States, we will continue to bear our fair share. We will continue to lead within NATO, and by doing so, we will defend the freedoms of the American people and the people of our allies. I'm happy to take a few questions.
Let's start off with Latvia TV, Ina Stratsgina.
Thank you so much. Mr. Pompeo, Ina Strazdina, Latvian television, seeing growing aggression of Russia, do you see that NATO presence in the Baltics is sufficient, or would you see even plans to strengthen it even more?
So there's lots of discussion always at this meeting, at the summit, at the leaders' meeting last July, about proper allocation of resources. Where are the right places? Where do we need to do more? We've certainly talked about that as a geographic matter, so I don't have anything to add with respect to the Baltic states today. But it's not just a geographic matter. We've also talked about new challenges that face us, right? So telecommunication systems, infrastructure, cyber, hybrid warfare, things that aren't resolved by more troops sitting on the ground someplace, but which present risk to the Baltics, to all of Europe, to all the NATO partners, including the United States and Canada as well. So we're trying to make sure that our resources, our focus, are meeting the challenges of today. We talked a lot about it, the 70th anniversary, we talked a lot about the history of the founders of the 12 nations that began this important alliance, and the fact that it's now our time, the leaders of today, to take on the mantle and the challenges that the world presents to NATO today.
Let's go to BBC. Barbara Plett-Usher.
Test, test. Mr. Secretary, on Turkey, the Turks are disputing your readout of the meeting you had with the Turkish foreign minister this week. So my question is, have you made any progress in meetings this week on issues like the S-400s and northern Syria, or have things actually gotten worse? And then I have another question about China. NATO allies have not followed U.S. requests to cut off Huawei. So do you think that that could become a risk for intelligence sharing and military communications in the alliance in the future?
So as for the first question, I reread, I saw the comments by my Turkish counterpart. I reread the readout of our meeting. Spot on. Stand by every word of it. We are continuing to have conversations. I think the Turkish government understands the American position quite clearly. I think I heard the Vice President speak to that yesterday as well. Our position hasn't changed. There's great opportunities for the United States and Turkey to work closely together, and I had a good long conversation with the Turkish foreign minister yesterday, and I'm very confident we'll find a path forward. As for the risks associated with the installation of Chinese technology in systems related to security, there is undoubtedly the risk that NATO or the United States will not be able to share information in the same way it could if there were not Chinese systems inside of those networks, inside of those capabilities. We've done our risk analysis in the United States. We have now shared that with our NATO partners, with countries all around the world. They understand the concerns, not our concerns, but the factual concerns associated with companies so deeply connected to their own government, who would be willing to act at the behest of their government, the risk that that presents to information management. And we've made clear that if the risk exceeds the threshold for the United States, we simply won't be able to share that information any longer. And our task is to do education, make sure they understand every sovereign nation that will make its own decision, and then the United States will make its decision.
Let's go to Italy. La Stampa. Paolo Mastrolilli.
Thank you very much. Two questions. Today, the Libyan General Haftar ordered his troops to march on Tripoli. Did you discuss this issue in terms of the terroristic threat from the south? And the second question, Italy signed a BRI initiative with China. Do you consider that to be a threat to the interoperability of NATO?
So with respect to the first question, Libya, I don't have anything to add. We're following closely what has been taking place there over the past weeks and months. We've been following the UN process, trying to do the best we can to be a positive force to deliver a good solution for the people of Libya and increased stability there, to be sure. Second, as I said in response to the previous question, every country has to make its own decisions about how it wants to respond to Chinese debt trap diplomacy or Chinese efforts to sell goods at below market that clearly have a security component to the transaction. But each nation will make its own choices. Then the task falls to every other country to observe that, see what risk it presents to them if they begin to engage in those systems, in that infrastructure, that IT infrastructure or transportation infrastructure, and respond to that threat.
Germany, DPA, Ansgar Haas.
Let me just add one thing to that. It is one thing to compete in an open, fair, transparent way. The United States is prepared to compete with our NATO allies, with China, with any country that shows up with a commercial transaction, a better mousetrap, a better idea, and compete with fair, reasonable, transparent transactions. It is a very different thing to engage in transactions that have a national security component to them. When a nation shows up and offers you goods that are well below market, one ought to ask what else is at play, why it was that that entity showed up with a deal that is literally too good to be true.
DPA, please.
Thanks, Maren Hennemouth, TPA. The president and the vice president have been quite clear that they want Germany to step up on defense spending. So, but according to the latest projection, they won't even reach 1.5% in 2024. What concrete consequences is the U.S. considering if they don't step up? Do you have any steps in mind, like withdrawing troops from Germany?
It's important to step back just a bit. Remember that this notion of 2% isn't made up. It wasn't created by this administration in the United States. It wasn't created by the previous administration in the United States. It was a commitment that every NATO ally agreed to in Wales. That includes Germany, who committed to that. So the promise that is being fulfilled is a promise that the German government made. So we're very hopeful. We're very hopeful that they will get it right, that they will understand that it is important for our collective defense, and we will urge them to continue to do so.
We have Norway, Aftenposten. No? Please, go ahead.
I just wanted to ask you, Secretary, I'm from Spain, from ABC. Did you manage to talk about Venezuela and the presence of Russian troops in Venezuela as a part of the meeting today? And what's your position regarding those 100 soldiers that, according to Special Envoy Abrams, were calibrating a missile system?
We did talk about Venezuela. The American position was made clear by President Trump. They need to leave. And we talked about that. We talked about that in the context of Russian efforts all around the world, whether that's efforts in Ukraine, the Russians' continued malign activity in Syria. We talked about it in Venezuela. We talked about what they did in the Sea of Azov. In each case, we are doing our best collectively to respond. In the case of Venezuela, the United States has its responses being prepared as well.
Let's do one more question. Sir, in the pink shirt back there, please. Yes.
Hello. My name is Farhad Pouladi. I'm with the Voice of America Persian Service. In your morning's remark, you said NATO should seek peace through strength in era of great power competition from Russia, China, and Islamic Republic of Iran. So my question is this. What challenges the NATO and specifically the U.S. is facing from regime in Tehran? Thank you.
The list is long, but let me speak about it in countries the risks to countries other than the United States. I've articulated the threat that we believe the Islamic Republic of Iran presents to our country. They are many. We've asked the Islamic Republic of Iran to simply behave like a normal nation, but let me give you a concrete example. Today, there continues to be a concerted assassination effort, campaign, inside of Europe. We've seen it. You've seen European countries respond to this threat. This is real. This isn't something that was made up. This is an effort by the leaders of the Islamic Republic of Iran. The President Rouhani, who's the president of Iran, is permitting to take place, where they're going to Europe and killing people on European soil. This is unacceptable. In Western Europe, to allow something like this to happen is just unacceptable. We are working with our partners all around Europe to make sure we all have the right information placed in the right place at the right time to reduce this risk and reduce this threat. But a second component of this is the deterrence effort, which is the undertaking that the United States is engaged in to reduce the capacity of the Islamic Republic of Iran to undertake precisely this kind of activity by sanctioning them in a way that forces them to have fewer resources so that they can create these risks around the world. I'll give you a second one we spent time on today. There are European foreign terrorist fighters sitting today in Iraq and in Syria that we now have to figure out a way to make sure do not return to the jihadi battlefield. The efforts that Iran is engaged in Syria fundamentally make that problem set more difficult. as do Iranian Shia militias that are not under the control of the Iraqi security forces in Iraq. That malign activity by Iran makes Europe, NATO countries, less secure. We talked about those. We talked about how we would collectively seek to approach them to reduce the risk to NATO members. Great. Thank you all very much for being with me today.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.